Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Abrar. I'm the Executive Director of Refugee and Migratory Movements Research Unit. On behalf of RMMRU, that's the acronym for our research unit, I welcome you all to this fourth e-symposium, which we have titled as Build Back Better. We are all aware that COVID-19 pandemic has affected every sector of the society all over the world. Needless to say, it is the people on the margins of society, refugees, migrants, minorities, the displaced, the aged, those physically and mentally challenged, and those belonging to LGBTQ groups. They are the ones who are bearing the brunt of the pandemic disproportionately. The pandemic also provides us an opportunity to look back, take stock and plan to build better. It is in this context that RMMRU has initiated an e-symposium series on COVID-19 and migration that we have titled as Build Back Better. Our previous three events were on wage theft of forcibly repatriated Bangladeshi migrant workers, experiences of return of South Asia migrant workers, and the third one was on how the pandemic is affecting Rohingya refugees, both on land in different countries of asylum, and also those who are still drifting on sea. Today, we talk about a particularly vulnerable category of migrants, the women migrants, and try to shed light on the lived reality of those migrants, the problems they are encountering, the engagement of countries of destination and countries of origin, and other actors in mitigating their plight. We have been informed by UNDESA, 130 million international migrants, female migrants are there, that constitute 47.9% of the total stock of international migrants. Obviously the pandemic has affected adversely, as I said, this particular group. Restrictive conditions have aggravated their plight. It has increased their workload. Lack of rest has been a major problem. And as one returning migrant said, it has become an endless Ramadan, because during Ramadan, they have to work extra hours, many, many hours. But this time it has prolonged, that's what she was referring to. Because of mobility restrictions, they cannot, send remittances, top up their mobile phone to be in touch with their loved ones in times of distress. If you're unable to contact your loved ones, your problems further compound, And also little things, but important issues, like buying personal hygiene products. They cannot go out, so they cannot bring them in. Those who are working in the formal sectors are also having problems, like their male counterparts, reduced wages, social distancing, PPE, non-availability of PPE, and the rest of it. I'm not going to preempt what our panelists are going to say, but what we are trying to suggest is, these are the issues, and we are not aware much about these particular problems. And that's why we have titled it as Drawing the Curtain. We'll make a valiant effort in this regard today. And we are delighted to have a rich resource of panelists who have immense experience, insights, and expertise to share with us. All are deeply engaged in migrant worker issues in general, and also with women migrants. We believe by the end of the program, as all of our previous engagement, we will be able to provide a set of policy recommendations, or at least, try to find a set of policy recommendations, both for countries of origin and countries of destinations to pursue. So this is where I think the collective resource that we have garnered here today with your generous time, we would like to take this issue forward. With those few introductory statements, I'm not going into the details because it's all there in the concept note. So I really would like to give maximum time to the panelists and for the participants to engage in a serious sort of discussion on this. And as we have done in the past, we expect people to put in their questions in the chat box. If they like, they can mention to whom they're addressing this. And I'm delighted to say that we have Barrister Sarah Hussain, leading rights activist and honorary director of Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust. In all likelihood, she's going to join us. She has got some other engagement, but she said she's going to join us as well to secure her insight about this particular issue. And many other persons I know with immense interest or immense experience are joining this event. So we look forward to your kind comments. And now it's my pleasure to invite Alex. Its details are in the bios that we have provided. He's the Vice President of Transient Workers Count 2 in Singapore. It is the largest group that Bangladesh, it's interesting that his group provided, Bangladeshis were the largest group that received services from TWC2 over the past few years. They're under crucial services in helping workers making rightful claims, including through strategic litigation. The organization also engages in research, public engagement, and communication. So Alex, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. I have a computer with a rather unreliable microphone.
But we can hear you, Alex. We can hear you.
Thank you so much. If I suddenly turn mute, then please somebody wave or signal or put something in the chat box. That's what happens when you use the computer too much. But anyway, so thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Abrar. I will be using a PowerPoint. So I'm going to do a share screen right now because it helps me collect my thoughts better. So there we are. And we're going, let me get rid of this first. Right, so where are we? Okay, so as a bit of background, I don't know whether this is going to get in the way. All right, it's a bit of background. I should tell you that women migrant workers are in both the domestic as well as the non-domestic sectors. Of course, they predominate in the domestic sector, and but on the other hand, they're a relatively small minority in the non-domestic sector. On this slide, you will see where the main countries that they come from. And since the audience is largely Bangladeshi, you will notice straight away that as far as women migrant workers are concerned, Bangladesh does not figure in the list of countries of origin. In fact, I seriously doubt if there are more than even just 10 Bangladeshi domestic workers in Singapore, even if it's more than 5, okay? They are really, really rare. In all these 10 years or 9 years I've been with TWC2, I haven't yet seen a single Bangladeshi domestic worker. Okay, some numbers just to put it in context. So I just have 2 slides to set the context. There are 1.4 million households in Singapore, 260,000 FDWs, foreign domestic workers. And if we assume that it is almost always 1 FDW per household, it means about 18.5% of households have a domestic worker. So about COVID, the first thing you're going to notice is, let me get rid of this. How do I do that? Okay, the first thing you're going to notice is that if you look at the statistics, we have about 48,000 cases of COVID so far, but something like 98% of them are migrant workers in the non-domestic sector, almost all male, living in large dormitories. There are very few female domestic workers who have been affected by COVID. So, you know, the impact on domestic workers would be very few. I won't talk much about non-domestic workers in the interest of time. So I'm going to confine myself to domestic workers. Treatment is fully covered by the government. This is proven. We've had many cases come through us of COVID-19, and in all cases, they've had their treatment covered by the government. And they've been allowed to stay in luxury hotels while they recover. It's really quite fantastic. Well, as we know, you know, as Dr. Abrar has already said, for the last, so what, now is July. So for the last 6 months, since February, domestic workers have been strongly discouraged from going out on their rest days. So that doesn't mean they are totally locked up at home. They do go out, they go marketing, they go shopping, but they're strongly discouraged to go out for socializing purposes. So, you know, they can take the kids to the kindergarten and so forth, but they can't quite go out and see their friends. There isn't actually a law about that. Some very strong advisories, but obviously the employers would, you know, kind of like impose their will on the foreign domestic workers anyway. And many places have been shut down so that even if they wanted to gather somewhere, they couldn't. So of course, that means they were working at home 7 days a week, or nearly 7 days a week. And the worst part was that during April and May, when Singapore itself was under a lockdown and everybody was told to please try to work from home, it meant that the employer, instead of going out to work, was almost always at home too. So, and also they could, so that the domestic worker then felt that she was under the watchful eye of the employer all hours. And of course, some of them had planned home leave for this year, and that has had to be cancelled. Thus, social life has been reduced. There's been a lot of psychological stress reported by domestic workers because they are under greater watch, under greater vigilance. And because the employer is there, you can't quite rest, you feel very guilty, and so you end up doing a little bit more work. Okay, we know all this, that, you know, domestic workers earn less than non-domestic workers, yes. They are not covered by labor laws. That's true in so many countries. They're not covered by work injury insurance, which is also part of the former labor laws. And because they have to live in the same apartments as their employers, they may face privacy issues if they don't have a room of their own, which is quite common actually, all right? But, you know, I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes taking the contrarian view. I think some of those of you who know me before, like, you know, Roula, Ellen, they know that I like to take the contrarian view. And my statement here is that domestic workers are better off than non-domestic workers in 3 important ways. I'll take each one in turn and just briefly cover. Of course, if you want me to expand on them, I'll take them at question time instead, rather than go into too much detail right now. The use of licensed employment agents is very interesting. We almost never see licensed employment agents substantially involved with non-domestic workers. With domestic workers, they do come through licensed agents, and that usually means lower recruitment costs compared to non-domestic workers. So a domestic worker may end up having to pay a total from both sides, both countries, of maybe about $1,500 US. But the non-domestic worker, particularly male workers, the first-time worker may have to pay something like, you know, $8,000, $10,000 US. And even a rehired worker would still have to pay somewhere in the region of $4,000, $5,000 US. So the non-domestic workers, particularly the men, pay a lot more than the women domestic workers. Because there's a role for the licensed employment agent, the Singapore state, insists that the agent must remain involved during the working period of the domestic worker. And this is important because sometimes a dispute arises, and at least there is a kind of a third party, the employment agent, who will try to mediate. And if the domestic worker is no longer able to stay in the employer's apartment, at least she will have accommodation provided by the employment agent. This presence of a third party being able to provide some support is not present in the cases of many non-domestic workers because they just simply don't have a licensed employment agent behind them. And because domestic workers go through licensed employment agents, and then when they have trouble, they go back to the employment agent, they have a far better success rate from our casework we've noticed in finding transfer jobs. The next important factor is that domestic work is far less sensitive to economic cycles, and we actually don't expect much by way of retrenchment post-COVID. The other thing is that there's a need for the employee to come on board really quick, because when it comes to things like elder care and child care, and in Singapore, nearly all women are career women, they work, okay? So they just can't leave the child alone at home. They can't leave the invalid grandmother at home. They really need a domestic worker real fast. And that means in terms of the bargaining relationship, domestic workers are in a better position than the non-domestic worker. Now that somehow doesn't translate to better salaries. That's because there are always so many available domestic workers from abroad. But it does mean that the transfer market is a whole lot more active. And when the Ministry of Manpower says, I'm not giving you a work permit until you settle your problems with your previous employee, then of course, if the employer has not paid, say, the last 3 months' salary, you'll find that the employer will pay up quite quickly because they desperately need a new domestic worker. So we find from our casework that on average, domestic worker cases tend to be concluded within a matter of weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks at most, whereas non-domestic worker cases tend to drag on for months, typically 4 months, 8 months, 12 months, 18 months, that kind of thing. It's ridiculous, but that's the difference. Now, here's something contrarian. They are outside the labor laws, which actually confers a certain advantage, because the labor laws have very strict processes for dispute handling. And when you go through these processes stage by stage and wait for the court date and so forth, it's really, really slow. Whereas when dispute settlement is just through the willpower of the ministry officials, they say, let's get this done, let's sort it out. Or he's going to say, I'm not going to give you a new work permit for a new worker until you sort it out with the old worker. Then, you know, they actually have an advantage by not following the processes laid down by our inflexible labor laws. So that's one new advantage. So let's do a bit of crystal ball gazing. Okay, we don't expect major retrenchments of domestic workers. However, Singapore has already gone into a recession, and we don't expect this year to be good at all. There will be some employers who might have to suffer a pay cut from their own jobs out there. There may be some employers who are kind of like their own business. They run their own business and that may not be doing well. So there may be a little bit of pressure on wages rather than outright retrenchments. But it's really hard for us to say until we've gone a few months ahead. Travel restrictions are still here. That means no new domestic worker or any other migrant worker for that matter can enter Singapore for the time being. So there's a total ban of new workers arriving. And really that's actually good news for all the workers who are already here. They can get transfer jobs more easily. We've seen several cases now where male construction workers who used to have a really difficult time getting transfer jobs have suddenly been able to get transfer jobs within a matter of 10 days. It's just amazing historically, by historical standards, because employers need the workers and they just cannot get fresh workers from abroad. So that's about the, you know, just the chief bullet points. If you want me to expand on any of these, I'll take some questions later on. Okay, thank you. Let me stop share and yeah, so I'm back. Okay, so back over to you. Abrar?
Thank you, Alex. Oh, that's great. And just to update you about the participants, I'm delighted to say that we have participants as many as from 17 countries, 17. That includes the Philippines, UK, Australia, Senegal, Canada, Palestine, Bangladesh, India, Thailand, Morocco, Yemen, and also Argentina. I wonder what's the time like there. So that's the sort of, I'm delighted that it has generated that kind of interest. Thank you, Alex, for your whatever you have said. And we understand the position, the points that you have made. It's true of Singapore, but not necessarily of other countries. So there are a lot of vulnerability issues. And we have a very competent panel. So I'm sure if they have any points to take up with you, they certainly will. Now I invite our dear friend, Ellene Sana. Ellene is the Executive Director of Center of Migrant Advocacy based in the Philippines. She has been involved in fact, both of us and with many others have been involved in advocacy and lobbying work, at regional and international forums, and she did at local, national sort of forums. So it's a very rich CV. She is a serving member of many important alliances and organizations. Ellene, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Abrar. Let me see if I can manage the share.
That's a familiar smiling face.
The share. Okay. I think I'm already sharing my slide, no? So the points that Alex made, I will not have a debate on that yet. Let me present my slides first. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share also the experiences of Filipino women migrant workers in the time of COVID. So I'll be presenting some facts and figures based on government statistics, government sources, and then also, of course, the impact of COVID, and what could be our thinking in terms of moving forward, no, with all of these challenges brought about by COVID. Okay, I'm supposed to do, is it? Yeah, okay, I think, yeah, okay. So let me start with some statistics. While globally, men still have bigger numbers in terms of the number of migrant workers. In the case of the Philippines, since 2014, women migrants have already outpaced the men migrants. So this time it was in fact higher this year at 56%, 56% women and 44% men. Also, it's been observed that women migrants are younger, between the age bracket of 25 to 39. And perhaps later on we will explain, we can understand why there are more young women women migrants than male migrant workers. And of course, the other opposite is for 40 years old and above, we have more male migrant workers. But where are our women? They are employed, and that's good news. The women are, you can see from the pie graph, from the pie chart, 62.5% of our women migrants are in domestic work. Ooh, more than 50%. And then the other big percentage is in the service and sales sector. The others are like 9.8 is with the professionals, and then the others are in small, very, very small number. But the majority are in low wage. Those that are classified as low-skilled occupation. And you can imagine that because they are low wage, if they're not living in their employers' houses, then they may be doing shared accommodation, very small spaces that they share with other migrant workers. They are outside the ambit of legal protection, and this is like the opposite of probably what Alex was saying, that somehow there is a good side to being outside of the coverage of the laws. But this is in the context that then you cannot sort of like invoke the law to exercise your right, to assert your right. Yeah, so one example is in Hong Kong, they have already a minimum allowable wage for foreign domestic workers. And therefore, when the Hong Kong government enacted a statutory minimum wage, the argument is, okay, let's not include anymore the foreign domestic workers because they already have the minimum allowable wage, which is lower than the statutory minimum wage. Of course, because of the nature of their job, they are required to keep close contact either with their clients, because they may be in the hospitality sector, in hotels, in the malls, in shops, clients, customers, their patients, their wives, because we have also a lot of nurses and also other health workers and their consumers. So that will have impact on this COVID pandemic, because of course everybody's affected, but some are more heavily affected than the others, and that goes for the migrant workers. But I will just say that what drives Filipinos to take the migration option? It's a push and a pull factor, of course. In the Philippines, as maybe similar to other countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia, they go to Singapore for mainly for economic reasons, but also there are other issues. It could be political, and probably at this time under the present dispensation, some would be thinking of going abroad for political reasons. Climate change has always been there already. You know, we have been very prone to a lot of typhoons and floodings and everything. It could also be social, cultural, and personal. It could be to escape from violence and the like, especially for women migrants. But if you will note as well, in terms of the employment participation of women, less than 50% of our women workers are working. And the reason for this is because they are doing household duties. So 55% of those not in the labor force are doing household duties. That's why they cannot join the labor force. The others, 27%, is into schooling, and a smaller number at 13% is because of age and permanent disability. But if you compare it to the men, in terms of the share of the household duties, it's only 11% of the male workers. And that's why, it's one explanation why they're able to join the labor, why they're able to have employment in the Philippines. And the other fact is that 3/4, and this is based on a study, 3/4 of the unpaid care work in the house is really done by women. And if you monetize it, it's going to be equivalent to 1.875 trillion pesos. I do not know how big it is, but it's supposed to be big because it's in trillion. But of course, migration doesn't happen just because we have this push factors from the Philippines. And as Alex said, for example, we have a lot of Filipinos in Singapore, both domestic and non-domestic. So one explanation is because some countries do lack workers in certain sectors of the economy. There are also jobs that local Singaporeans will not take in or accept. Maybe it's so stressful, maybe the wages are low, and government is not making improvements in the workplaces and everything. And because of this oversupply of workers in countries like the Philippines, we're just too happy to fill in the vacancy. So that would be one explanation why there is migration that takes place. Also, and as Alex said, there is a high demand. There has been a steady high demand for the care economy because of the aging population globally. No, and this is, of course, the obvious benefit of migration. And if you will note from the statistics of the Philippine Statistics Authority, the bigger proportion is coming from the Middle East, where we have the most number of migrant workers. But then if you check out against the occupation, the one that contributed the highest in terms of sending money regularly to the Philippines are the domestic workers at 27.1%. Followed, and then also 15.5% coming from those in the sales and services sector. So these are mainly where the women are mostly represented. So, but it also tells a lot on the fact that the reason they send religiously their money to the Philippines is because their families are there. And why can't they bring their families to the countries of destination? Because they cannot afford, because they are low wage. And Singapore will not allow them that they bring in their family members, or not even in the Middle East, where probably spaces are big. But then, of course, the consideration always is, can you afford to have your family members in those countries? And again, women are disproportionately denied this right to family reunification because of that, the concentration in low wage works. But then, while they are disproportionately represented there, they are also disproportionately represented in terms of those who are abused, distressed, and trafficked. And this data that I'm showing you is not even COVID times. These are like the normal, so-called normal times. And you can see overwhelmingly the repatriated, distressed workers, the traffic workers are women. You have like even 100% of the traffic cases in 2015, 100% women. So that is already the situation prior to COVID. No? And explanations why this is so is because a lot of people are not aware of information about programs and services of government, much so for the women migrant workers. And for those who have experienced abuse or victims or survivors of domestic violence or violence while they are working overseas, they don't know what the services are from our government. And if at all they are aware of that, they think that these are inadequate or irrelevant or not gender responsive, or they are inaccessible. And this is from the study of the Labor Department. Of course, it's a bit dated, but again, it tells you of the situation. Now here comes COVID. So now the number of Filipino cases is 74,000 and increasing. This is from July 17. But what we wanted to say here is that the impact of COVID is very deep and devastating, and it has magnified the deplorable living and working conditions of migrant workers, both men and women, but more so for the women. But at the same time, it also made visible the important contributions of our migrant workers in the provision of care, whether you're talking of personal care or household care, in the health sector and in other essential services. That if not for them, then probably we would be in a far worse situation. And in terms of figures, this is from the ILO 2020 June. Workplace closures affected 93% of the world workers, including our migrant workers. Work losses is equivalent to 400 million full-time jobs. So that's already like the scale of the impact of COVID, and it's not stopping in July. That's the situation. So just to give you a sense of how this has impacted on our migrants, as of July 17, we have more than 8,000 overseas Filipinos with COVID. Of course, we have very, very good recovery rates as well. Fortunately, the data is not sex desegregated, so we do not know how many men or how many women. But maybe what Alex is saying is not as much cases for women like in the domestic work sector, but I think it's really more for those workers like in shared accommodation in the Middle East, where they share one room, 4 persons sharing one room, that would have higher rates of infection, no? But then it's not only like the health dimension of workers that is being affected by COVID. Facilitation of repatriation by government as of July 16 is already 86,000, more than 86,000. And we started with a high number for sea-based cruise ships. We have a lot of people in the cruise ships, also including women migrant workers. But now they are unemployed. The ships have to stop sailing because of COVID, but maybe not the cruise ships, but later on they will have to pick it up. Otherwise, the world will be in for a collapse. But then we can see that the numbers being repatriated, we see a lot more land-based now coming from the Gulf states, and a lot more are being stranded, no? So job displacement, the estimate of the Labor Department, it will reach more than 1 million of our migrant workers by the end of 2021. And already up to May, we have displaced workers of more than 300,000. And these are actual displacements of workers. They have lost their jobs outright. They are on a no work, no pay arrangements. Their wages are reduced and similar arrangements. And of course, the other thing with COVID or epidemics or pandemics is that migrants as mobile population have always been looked upon or accused of being the carriers of the disease. But how come it's only the migrant workers? Even the rich people, they travel a lot. All those businessmen, they travel, but they do not carry the stigma of being the carriers of the disease. It's really like the migrant workers. And I think this is something that hopefully let us take part in combating this stigmatization and discrimination against our migrant workers. But of course, will migration stop with the COVID? As I think Alex already mentioned, no, it's not going to stop. It will continue. But of course, the question now and the challenge also for us as advocates is under what conditions, how much will it cost, and who pays the cost? What will be the terms of endearment? Of course, true to the focus of this forum, we must get back, but it has to be better, safer, and fairer migration for women, and of course for men as well. But because for the longest time, migrant workers have had this decent work deficits, social protection, and we have seen this right on our faces with this pandemic, that people have no resources whatsoever, no access to social services. Even if countries of destination are saying free treatment and everything, it's easier said than done when there are no effective enabling mechanisms. Social dialogue, of course, is a no-no in many countries. Rise at work is always that the general idea is, oh, migrants are cheaper than the local workers. So this is the situation, and we don't want to go back to that situation when we survive this pandemic. And that's why, first and foremost, we have to address our own survival, the survival of migrants in this pandemic, in terms of providing information against women, particularly because in these trying times, always you get higher cases of violence against women migrants. Where can we find the hotlines? People are starving because they are on no work, no pay basis. They are retrenched, but they have not gone back to the country yet. So, and the mental health, it's very stressful to be in a situation where you have nothing. You have practically no resources to speak of, and you do not know when you will be repatriated to your country. Accommodations, that we have to make arrangements already, inclusive policies, programs, and services. Doing a needs analysis, we participated in a rapid gender assessment of the impact of COVID on migrant workers, access to justice, government personnel, and service providers. We have to think that we have to have those issues in place. And then probably as we move forward, we can sustain psychological support services, including mental health, come up with sex disaggregated data collection for the affected population. What is the job status? What are the skills inventory of our workers? How many have been robbed of the wages and other earned benefits? We have to do a documentation of that. Then we have to continue humanitarian assistance and repatriation, justice for wage step, and I think this has been mentioned, and this was part of this was the focus of the webinar of RMMRU in the past. We need to be very conscious of skills upgrading. It's not enough that you say, I am jobless. You have to do an inventory. What can you do? Especially because the economy is in slump. We have to be able to contribute in rebuilding the economy, and this should go with your skills. More job options for women workers. It cannot be we're lucky because we have work, but it's always domestic work and care work. We should be venturing on other job opportunities, and government should be conscious of that. There should be equal pay for work of equal value. Job creation plans. We just had our meeting today in the National Tripartite Council in the Philippines, and one of the agreements is we try to come together in a TWG, technical working group, to collectively discuss how do we create jobs, not only for the local workers displaced, but for those tens of thousands of migrant workers who have been repatriated and are also still continue to come back. Liberate the women from the household work. Care work in households must be shared. You cannot expect the women to join the labor force if they are expected to do all of this household work and taking care of the children and everybody else in the house. It has to be a shared work in the households. Migration governance. We need to revisit our migration governance to make sure it's human rights based. Big words, that it should be gender responsive at the same time. Whole of government and whole of society approaches. These are all like part of the goals of the Global Compact for Migration. And gender equality must be in law and in fact. De jure, de facto. And I will end by saying that you first and foremost, it should start also with our government people, the duty bearers. They must walk the talk. It's not enough that we have provisions that, this law is gender sensitive, but what does that mean if the situation of women is not really improving? So I think I'm finished. I'm sorry if I over time my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ellen. No, it's fascinating. Not only you sort of dealt with the concerns of the Filipino migrants, but also the broader pictures that you have brought in. And that has particularly been one of the major goals here. It's now my pleasure to invite, we have heard two country experiences, one of the Philippines, the other of Singapore. Now we will sort of broaden our sort of horizon and listen to two persons. First, I invite Roula. Roula Hamati is the coordinator of the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, a network of active civil society organizations in the Arab and the Mediterranean region. So, and she also acts as the head of advocacy and research of Insan Association, a Lebanese human rights organization. It's there in her short bio. It's a pleasure, Roula. It's your, call.
Thank you, Dr. Abrar, and it's really good. I'm very happy actually to follow after Alex and Ellen, because I think there are so many kind of thought-provoking elements that they both touched upon. My idea for this webinar is also kind of to give an idea about how things are for women, maybe in a different region, in the Arab region in general. And I know Ellen already spoke about in depth a lot about the issue of domestic worker in this part of the region. To start maybe on a kind of a statistics note, we heard that more than half of Filipino migrant workers are women. When it comes to the Middle East region, in the region itself, there are 23 million migrant workers, 39% of which are actually women. And I think that the problem is in this part of the world, I mean, obviously we always talk about recruitment. We always talk also about, policies in countries of origin that are not necessarily helping women. And this is well known and this is well established. But in this part of the world, there are also kind of all sorts of problems when it comes to women's work. And I think one of the biggest problem there is that so far, the work of women remains largely informal, undervalued, and unprotected. And I think in Ellen's presentation, we talked about the whole notion of, the value of women's work. And in this region, in the Arab region in particular, the whole notion of being able to bring migrant workers, and also in particular in the domestic worker sector, has been one of the kind of the biggest factor why women in this region have assumed more role in the economy, has been able to leave the household and also work. So I think this is a crucial link. And we spoke a lot about, the need to also, go beyond these kind of gender division of labor, where for women to be able to actually work, other women have to take care of, the traditionally what has been seen as women's work. In this particular region, I think obviously we cannot talk about the work of women without talking about the issue of domestic workers, and also the issues of women in other sectors. But I think the vast majority of women in this region who come to work are domestic workers, and others are also in the service sector, as has been covered. And so far, and I think it's become to a level where when we talk as activists in this region, when we talk about, the sponsorship system and problems within the sponsorship system, I think it's been so addressed and so kind of brought up that sometimes even policymakers, they kind of, overlook us, like come with something new. But I mean, how do you come with something new when one of the biggest structural problems is still there and nobody's really addressing this? And when we talk about kind of the sponsorship, I think we need to break it down as well, in talking about the kind of status dependency that this creates for women and also for men as well. It's not just a women's issue, but for women in a domestic workers relationship, this is particularly difficult because it implies not only that they are dependent on their employers for status, but that they are also living with their employers and within households. Sometimes these households are abusive households, and that opens up the whole question of how do you access justice? How do you get redress when you are living with your employer? And any breach of that kind of, work relationship results in you being undocumented. And I think this has been kind of one of the biggest challenges in this part of the region. The other challenge, obviously, is really related to this whole notion of labor in general and women's work being dependent on models of temporariness. So meaning workers are here on contracts, they do not get full status, they do not get, the opportunity to stay on, they are just there on a temporary basis. And this in itself creates a lot of vulnerabilities. One, in being able to kind of, move within the labor markets, because there are lots of restrictions on the ability to move whether from employer to another, but also move in terms of, you know, finding different kind of job categories. This is very much still restricted. The other issue that I wanted to touch upon, and this is a big issue affecting women migrant workers in the region, and I believe Ellen has also talked about it, is the whole absence of even the notion of talking about, you know, we talk about human rights, but when it comes to family rights, nobody really talks about it. And we have these, you know, millions of migrant women coming to this region in particular in these low-skilled mobility scheme, if we can say, and being completely denied of family rights. And we have seen in this region a lot of examples where this happens, and it happens under different ways, because for one instance, you know, women who migrate, you know, as domestic workers are not allowed to bring their family members. But we also have another layer to this. Women who establish families in countries of destination often face very difficult consequences. They face consequences in terms of, you know, detention, in terms of deportation. And we have seen this happen across different countries in the region, where women who you know, have children are deported and are sent back home. There are all sorts of laws that are discriminatory in the region, what is known as the zina laws, which are really kind of punishing women for any kind of sexual relationship outside of marriage, and children are often proof of these kinds of relationships. So this not only kind of has a consequence in terms of, you know, detention and deportation, but also adding a criminal dimension to all of this, contributing to this, you know, denial of, you know, sexual and family rights for women. And the expectation is, you know, the expectation is so huge on people, because the whole notion of these kinds of employment system is that people are there on a temporary basis, but we know that they are temporary for a very long time. So often it is a temporariness of 20 and 30 years. And the expectation is that, you know, they will not have families, they will not bring their families, they will live without their families. And this situation has worked for countries of destination, but also, if I can say, worked for countries of origin, because it kept the remittances going back home. So there is no real incentive to kind of address this issue and to talk about, you know, when we talk about human rights, what do we mean by human rights? What is the fuller picture of human rights? So this is something else I wanted to bring up. Some examples in the region more recently have, you know, there was a blanket kind of ban on the ability of women, regardless of even kind of income level, to bring families and dependents. And this is starting to change, but this is only affecting high wage, high skill women kind of employment. It's not really affecting the lower wage. And even when there are kind of wage requirements, and even where there are occupational requirements, we know that at the bottom of this is kind of indirectly discriminating against women, because men have more advantage to benefit from such schemes. So I think it's time to kind of rethink and re-put this in the focus, because it's been kind of on the margins of our discussion about how do we reform these kinds of labor migration scheme. The other point I wanted to raise, and this has been really difficult in this region, is the whole question of justice and remedy. And I want to talk about justice from the context of, you know, domestic workers who live with their employers. And we know to access justice is absolutely very difficult. We've handled cases at the national level, you know, with women suffering all sorts of problems, from wages to abuse to sexual abuse and all of this. And we know from fact that very few of these kinds of cases end up going to court. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. You know, very few of these who go to court even are kind of resolved justly, because we know even within the court system there are all sorts of problems. But there are also, and there is a structural problem there, because the moment you need to leave the house of the employer, you are vulnerable and you become an absconding worker. So how can you, if you are kind of, you know, you suffered a rights violation, how can you go to the police? A police station that often does not believe you, a police station that often will believe your employer, that will not give you access to a translator that will just dismiss you. And we also know that there are cases, the moment that they go to report and kind of ask the assistance in this region, they are also kind of detained and deported. The employer has this kind of power to say, okay, I want to send the worker back. So this is kind of a huge obstacle. It also contributes to this culture that we have in this region of employer impunity, meaning the employer can just deport the worker at any moment in time, regardless of there are kind of pending cases or not. And this has created this culture of, you know, the employer is able to do what they want to do without really facing any consequences. And again, I think this is kind of the time we rethink that and we try to find kind of accountability within that. The second point with relation to women, and I think anybody who has been to the Middle East would know how many, how many domestic workers in particular are in the Middle East. I'll give you the example of Lebanon. 1 in 8 households employs domestic workers. The number is huge. And we see that they are kind of secluded. They are socially secluded and they are isolated from society. And when we talk about these kinds of global commitments under the GCM about, inclusion, these objectives and all of that, how much of that is in existence in these kinds of, employment systems and these kinds of employment regimes? We often find, domestic workers physically excluded from their employers, but we also know that migrants are generally, and migrant women are generally excluded from the larger population. And I think this is something that we need to kind of work on to break that cycle of isolation when people are abroad for many, many years and they are still kind of socially excluded and isolated. In terms of the COVID situation, and I really agree with Alex, at the beginning of it, I was looking at the numbers and I was looking like, oh, men are really kind of predominantly being the ones infected. And I see the reason why there could be situations where obviously, yes, domestic workers, for instance, did not lose as many jobs as other migrants in different sectors. So this sector is resilient, but that doesn't mean we don't need to look at the conditions within that sector. This is one. And I think for the Middle East region, the picture has been mixed, and it has been mixed even in the domestic worker sector, precisely because the whole question of, workers who are daily workers, workers who are undocumented, irregular workers, but who still do domestic work. For instance, in countries like Kuwait, in countries like Lebanon, in countries like Jordan, daily workers who do domestic work, talking about women here again, have been in really difficult and extreme situations, not being able to find employment because they depend on being able to find employment on a daily basis, not being even able to get food, not even being able to pay their shelter. So this is kind of the big consequence of COVID that we have seen on the ground. And obviously it has to do with the whole notion of, irregularity, the whole notion of, tying domestic work with the house of the employer, and not allowing for, more flexible models of domestic work, obviously. And we've also seen a decrease of labor rights reporting, labor rights violation reporting. And this is not because there are no violations, but people precisely are prioritizing their day-to-day subsistence. And I know I might have spoken a lot. Just as recommendations going forward, there are a few things that I think are important for us to reflect upon. One is the need for more diverse and safer pathways for women, and not just in the domestic worker sector. We need to look at other sectors. What are the other sectors in this region where women can assume a more prominent role? The second recommendation I would say is we need to also formalize, and we need to work on the whole notion of regularization, precisely because irregularity ends up being a vulnerable situation for workers, and we have seen this happen in terms of the impact of COVID. Thirdly, I think we need to kind of re-examine sponsorship. I know it's become old and it's become boring to some level, but the notion of being able to move, the notion of flexibility in employment regimes is really central if we are even going to talk about any of these other stuff that we touched upon. For instance, access to justice. How do we resolve that without being able to resolve mobility? How do we resolve isolation if we are not able to, at least ensure the rights to mobility and ending status dependency? Thank you very much. These are all the points from my end.
Thanks, Roula, for an excellent coverage, of what are the issues involved in that part of the world. And there are many issues that you have raised, issue of structural problems, the whole question of kafala, employers' impunity, right to family, decrease in incidences of reporting due to prevailing conditions. These are major issues of concern, and thanks also for coming up with a set of recommendations. Our last formal speaker today is Dr. Jean de Cunha. She is the UN Women's Senior Global Advisor on International Migration, based in its regional office of Arab states in Cairo, Egypt. She has served for a long 19 years in senior and management positions in UNIFEM, i.e. UN Women, including heading the East and Southeast Asia Regional Office. So you are in a very advantageous position in the sense that you have served in this region and you are also right now serving there. It's a privilege to have you in our forum. Your turn, Mr. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Abrar, for inviting UN Women to make this presentation entitled Women Migrant Workers, particularly domestic workers in the Gulf states in the context of COVID and beyond, which I'll briefly divide into 3 sections. The first will highlight some broad contextual trends. The second, specific COVID impacts on domestic workers. And the third will make recommendations drawing on creative practice of multiple stakeholders. So to begin with, the Arab region is a key destination site for migrant workers, with the 6 Gulf states accounting for about 10% of all migrant workers globally. Migrants outstrip or constitute a huge proportion of Gulf populations, and we have the UAE, 88% of migrant workers in the UAE at the highest levels. The majority of these workers come from Asia, but we also have sizable numbers coming from Africa. About 95% of these workers are low-skilled workers working in construction, domestic work, and so on. And about 120 billion US dollars, or about 20% or 27%, I think, of global remittances come out of the Arab region. 98% of this is from the Gulf states. The recent regional assessment report on migration says that women migrant workers constitute 32% of the 38 million migrants and refugees in the Arab region, and 60% of women migrant workers in the Arab region are in the Gulf states. Women domestic workers are about 44% of the 3.77 million domestic workers. And this is the bulk, about 62% of total female migrant employment in the Gulf states. And we know this is an underestimation because of the large number of undocumented workers. But women also work in other sectors, trade, services, and to a smaller extent in manufacturing and construction. Now, against this background and the need to veer away from overdependence on oil revenues, cross-regional dynamics, international dynamics, and the need to implement the 2030 SDG agenda and vision, many countries in the Arab region are actually diversifying their economic landscapes and prioritizing investments in high-tech areas, in the knowledge economy, services, the care sector, various subsectors of the care economy, which really hold out a promise for women migrant workers. They are promising to invest in increase in labor force participation rates of women in line with the SDGs, nationalizing their workforces, and this doesn't work in the interests of women migrant workers, but domestic workers may be resilient to this. And in the recent past, in the last 10 years or so, they have been introducing legal and institutional reforms and innovative programs to protect migrant workers, including domestic workers, in the area of labor rights, some reforms in the kafala system. But I will say there are huge policy deficits and policy and practice gaps abound. Well, COVID-19 has really uncovered the flaws in our societal ethic and fabric, which really lives off and works off discrimination of all kinds, including gender-based discrimination, particularly impacting poor men and women migrant workers in the hardest hit sectors where remote working is not possible, including in the care sector, or also in the care sector, which is at the front lines of response, and in domestic work, which is part of the care sector. So what are some of these impacts? Some of these have been mentioned, but I will reiterate and reinforce them. COVID panic has resulted in increased xenophobia and abuse, particularly of part-time live-out domestic workers whose contracts have been terminated overnight because they're seen as the vectors of the virus. So in irregular situations with no incomes, no ability to pay rents, no access to amenities and services, they're really stranded with border shutdowns and closures. They are in debt. their health is imperiled, and they are at risk of arrest, detention, and deportation. Many documented migrant workers, because of employer panic, inability to pay wages, have had their contracts terminated without any compensation, and many of them have been forced to return to countries of origin before their contracts have run the full course and before airports even shut down. Also, remittance transfers have been inhibited because of mobility restrictions, and this has placed families in dire straits. Increased workloads, work hours, stress levels, increased abuse because of lock-in with abusers, because whole families are working from home, because of school closures, because of employer panic and tension, because of employer obsession with cleanliness, have become real critical concerns for domestic workers. I will say that many of these violations are exacerbations of our pre-COVID days, given, as previous speakers have said, the peculiar nature of domestic work, the lack of monitoring, complaints, grievance redress mechanisms, and the kafala system, which ties a worker's entry, work, residence, and in some cases, exit to a particular employer or sponsor. And these employers often confiscate the worker's travel documents, rendering women workers and other workers to undocumented if she flees an abusive employer, or if she contracts a job with another employer without the previous written permission of her current employer, rendering her very vulnerable to arrest, to detention, deportation, without any access to justice. Health, no protective equipment, and many domestic workers continuing to work are at risk of COVID, tending to family members who are COVID infected, or if they have to run chores and errands. We have countries that have introduced free testing and free health facilities. Not very clear how this is panned out for undocumented workers, and who pays the costs for this testing and for this treatment. Undocumented migrant workers living in crowded rental apartments, in shelters, women migrant workers I'm talking about, and in detention centers, are at risk because these centers really have no adequate facilities and basic amenities, and they are not infection controlled environments. And this diminishes women's health, well-being, and privacy levels. So what do? COVID is an opportunity to build back better. Women migrant workers contribute solidly by way of their skills, their emotional labor, their physical labor. They make social contributions. They contribute by way of their remittances to countries of origin and countries of destination, and expenditures in these countries with multiplier effects. I will say that women migrant workers, and research has shown, earn less than men, but they tend to remit more predictably, even in times of crisis, and a greater proportion of their wages than men migrant workers. They must be protected. So countries of origin and countries of destination must really deploy a whole of government approach, because this is a multidisciplinary field, and a whole of society approach to actually introduce new interventions and to build on, to finesse, and to upscale existing good practices. But this needs to be done in strong consultation with women migrant workers and their support groups. And women migrant workers and their support groups must be strongly represented on COVID response mechanisms and in longer term decision-making mechanisms. So what needs to be done? Number one, there is a need for gender responsive analysis of the crisis, recovery packages, recovery plans, focusing on poor men and women migrant workers, low-skilled workers, in order to guide investment priorities. There is need to intentionally expand fiscal space for countries of the global south. There is need to intentionally invest in gender responsive budgeting so that our fiscal policies will actually address the short and long-term priorities of women migrant workers. And what must be invested in then? Investments must be made in the short term to protect migrant women workers' jobs and businesses through cash injections, through full wage payments in a timely manner, because often employers do have the money, but this is a ruse. Thirdly, by providing adequate notice and time for workers to contract other jobs should their contracts be closed. Documenting wage theft and facilitating wage recovery, provision of personal protective equipment, and facilitating remittance transfers online. And Qatar, for instance, has online remittance transfers and has directed employers to help with this. Investment in social safety nets, the need for income support, for food support, cash support, the need for accessible information to migrant workers that is related to COVID prevention, the need for free testing and treatment, not just related to COVID, but also violence, injuries on both sides of the border, countries of origin, countries of destination, and in conditions which are infection-free and are better equipped. There is need for regularization of undocumented migrant workers, and many countries in the region have introduced amnesty and regularization, but service providers and employers must know of this and must know what the procedures are. From a long-term point of view, it is absolutely essential that countries of origin and countries of destination undertake a rigorous analysis of the future of work for women migrant workers. Countries of origin must invest in better jobs and new employment that gives these workers the choice of whether or not to migrate, and they must prepare their workers for new openings, new jobs in the knowledge economy, various sectors of the care economy in countries of destination. Secondly, better and robust labor law coverage for women migrant workers and domestic workers in line with ILO standards, with CEDAW standards, and stronger enforcement, that is monitoring mechanisms, complaints mechanisms, grievance mechanisms. And this must be backed up with upgrading of skills, skills recognition, certification, accreditation, portability of skills, portability of social security, wage protection systems, and e-recruitment, ethical, well-monitored e-recruitment via a smaller cohort of registered agencies who can be monitored. And we need to build women's skills, raise their awareness, and facilitate them to use these e-recruitment channels, which really might cut off the middlemen and exploitative agents in between. Thirdly, the reform of the kafala system. It needs to be grounded in employment-based visas, not linked to individual sponsors. Women migrant workers must have the onus of actually renewing all their travel documents, their visas, their work permits, their residence permits, in enabling conditions provided for them to do so. There must be labor market flexibility. They should be able to contract new jobs, providing adequate notice to the employers and not tied only to the sponsor. There must be bridging time provided for them to contract new jobs, as also to stay on in the country of destination and work and press charges should they be violated. Fourthly, there is need to extend violence against women legislation to all women, to women migrant workers, undocumented women migrant workers, and access to sexual and gender-based violence services. There is need to look at alternatives to detention and deportation. And some of these countries in the short run have done so, but this needs to become a permanent feature of migration policies and laws, where deportation, so there have been regularization programs, and there must be access to essential services, but where deportation is necessary or has to be done, for instance, then there have to be safe houses provided, run by NGOs, for example, or residential community living where the human rights of migrant workers are protected and a safe return is guaranteed. There needs to be a determined struggle against racist, sexist, nationality othering, and xenophobia against migrant workers, including women migrant workers. And finally, we do need to leverage our regional processes, the Colombo process, the ADD process. Countries of origin must speak with a common voice to protect the concerns, the rights of women migrant workers, and not undercut one another. And issues such as labor protections, rights at work, reforms of the kafala system, accountabilities, and looking at guidelines, at frameworks to address migrant workers' concerns in emergencies, in pandemics, must occupy a more privileged space in these regional consultative process deliberations and in collaboration and coordination between countries of origin and destination. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dikuna. It's fantastic, the things that you have said with your vast experience, the insights that you have shared, the recommendations, the concrete recommendations that you have made, certainly has enriched this particular e-symposium. And my takeaway, I will not dare, selecting from the things that you have said. One thing really struck a chord in this very otherwise depressing environment. You said, opportunities for women to migrate will increase. I think that's something that our policymakers need to take care and negotiate, not from a weak position, but from a position of strength, and take up on the suggestions that you have made and others have made to bring about structural changes, particularly kafala system. Those are some of the things that we have to as civil society, we have to continue to harp on these issues, and that's something onus lies on us, and we should push our respective governments, cajole them, pressurize them, engage media, engage other civil society organizations in our respective countries, and also cross-border, and push the agenda further. I think these are some of the major issues that need to be taken on board from the presentation that you have made. Thank you. We have got some eminent migration experts of this region, Dr. Maruha Assis. We also have Professor Nasra Shah from Lahore, and she has a vast experience in Kuwait, having lived there for many years. We also have been joined by Barrister Sarah Hussain, our eminent rights activist in Bangladesh, Honorary Director of Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust. So it's my privilege that you have all joined. May I ask Dr. Maruha Assis, Scalabrini Migration Center, to sort of speak a few words. I know, Maruha, you have been shy to speak, but it'll be wonderful to hear you. Thank you, Maruha.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me? Yes, one moment. I think I have to use my speaker. Yes. So thanks very much, Abrar, for this space to share some thoughts. I actually have just a few quick points to add to what is already a very comprehensive and a very, very interesting discussion. Actually, a number of speakers have raised this particular issue, and I think especially in the presentation by Jean, she was mentioning about the need for a gender responsive analysis. And I think one of the ways in which we can have a better gender responsive analysis is also to consider the sectors or the occupations where migrants work in. Because, for example, normally when we think of migrants in vulnerable occupations, we typically think of migrants in domestic work, which makes a lot of sense for the various reasons that have also been explained by Ellen and the other discussants. But this idea of vulnerable occupations has also expanded. So, for example, in various destination countries, cleaners, they are not necessarily in domestic work. They could be working in hospitals, they could be working in malls, etc. But cleaners are also one example of migrant workers, the work that migrant workers do, which is not, which also borders on a lot of informal work arrangements. And again, if we think also of the other sectors that migrants work in, I think, for example, of the case of men working in the fishing sector. It's a sector that is very invisible. And it's also a sector where the wages are very low, and because men are at sea, they don't really have much access to support as other land-based workers have access to. So I think it's also important to think about migrant workers, think of course, of the gender lens, but in addition to also consider the sectors that they work in. And I think another point that I'd also just like to highlight is that with this particular pandemic, there's of course more discussions about the discourse of health securitization. And I think this is one of the things that we have to watch out for, because with health security, with this discourse of health securitization, we have to watch out for the possibility that this is also going to put migrants in a more marginalized position, and that this could also raise a lot of xenophobic and discriminatory policies and practices. And I think the last one that I'd also like to highlight is that we do need to strengthen social protection, particularly in a time when migrants are caught in between. And I'd also like to mention that I think this is one of the first experiences that we have here, for example, in the Philippines, where migrant workers, who are generally considered to be the country's new heroes, but because of this pandemic and because of this idea that migrants are carriers of the virus, I think this is one of the few times when migrant workers are experiencing also a lot of discrimination. So those are just some of the points that I'd like to add to the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marla of Scalabrini Migration Center in Manila. Now I invite, Professor Nasra Shah. Professor Shah, if you could join us now.
Thank you very much. And it's really, as Marla said, very comprehensive discussion. Okay, so what I want to do is just share a few thoughts with you about particularly focusing on the Gulf, where most of my experience is. But let me say a word about Bangladesh first. I know that Bangladesh has had a history of bans on domestic workers, and lifted the ban, then put the ban, then lifted, and lately, for the last 4 or 5 years, now the government has been encouraging outflows of domestic workers and actually made some arrangements with Saudi in that regard. And I wonder whether that policy is still continuing. The second point that I want to make is with regard to the focus on undocumented or irregular that several of the speakers highlighted. Now that is a very, very important aspect of the whole migration picture, including domestic workers. So because, I mean, just to put this in context, when I was looking at this in 2014, of all the known undocumented who were overstayers, 50% of them were domestic workers. So indeed, the domestic worker category is a very important one as far as irregularity is concerned. And therefore, the focus on this, we need to focus on this. And also, somebody raised the freelance or the daily wage who are working in the domestic sector, the daily wage workers in the domestic sector, or what I also call the freelance workers. Now, I've been collecting some data. One of my colleagues in Kuwait, actually, we've been talking to irregular migrant workers in this capacity. And we find that the freelance ones are in especially difficult circumstances. Then another point that I want to make is that the Gulf, I mean, one of the speakers mentioned that there are lots of, Roula, I think, mentioned that there are lots of domestic workers in the Arab region. Very true. Because in Kuwait, for example, 87% of all households have at least one migrant worker, at least one domestic worker. And some of them have 3 or 4. So indeed, this is a big category for work in the Gulf. Finally, so the point is that this will remain an important sector with all its vulnerabilities, and more attention needs to be paid to the kind of protection of rights that have been talked about in today's debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shah from Lahore University of Management Sciences. Professor Shah, that's the institution.
School of Economics.
Lahore School of Economics. Thank you. Now, before we move on to Barrister Sara Hussain, I'm just requesting our panelists to go through the chat box and collect their thoughts on the questions that have been posed. You did not respond to each and every one of them, and also any other thoughts that you may have, because we are nearing an end to the event. So now I invite Barrister Sara Hussain.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abrar Bhai. I'm not really a specialist in this area at all, but I was really interested to hear the comments, particularly from the Lebanese speaker about the challenges in terms of access to justice, and also from Dr. Kuna about the importance now on focusing on labor protections, and then just now from Dr. Nasra and her previous speaker about social protection. And I was thinking that in some of the issues that have become very stark is with the sort of transition to online services and virtual courts during the COVID period. If anything, access to justice in some ways has become far more challenging, because it's very difficult to get access to clients. It's very difficult to have, in some cases, to ensure open justice. At the same time, for example, as in Bangladesh, we've seen that it's taken a long time for the labor courts to go into the virtual court in the online process. And even now, it's not fully there. We've at the same time seen new sources of discrimination, as in the treatment of migrant workers when they were returning and the ways in which they were quarantined, but we don't really have legal protections in the context of discrimination. So I think we have a lot of new legal challenges that need to be addressed, both in terms of this online space to provide assistance and support and legal protection, and also to design new remedies and expand the existing labor laws in the ways that have been suggested. But I think a really big challenge now is to look at what would be the kind of legal regime underpinning social protection, and to see that as a kind of area for now regional and international collaboration. And finally, I think just going back to the Lebanese speaker as well, I think this is a very much a pre-COVID discussion as well, is how do we ensure more effective legal protection across our borders. It's been a constant challenge. We know all of the reasons why it doesn't happen. We always have migrant workers who come with the complaint, but then can't pursue it for various reasons. And how do we ensure more effective support across our borders and collaboration on that? I think that's just a continuing problem. And in some ways now, this COVID situation and the online situation is facilitating some cooperation and collaboration that previously would have been very difficult for us as lawyers and as service providers. So I hope that maybe we're also seeing some pathways through that now. Thanks, Abrar Bhai, for the opportunity to comment on this. It's been really interesting.
Thank you, Sarah, for joining us. Now we go back to the panelists. I think in the meantime, they could have a look at the questions that were placed by the participants, and also any other issue they would like to have. Before we, after they have spoken, we'll try to present to you some of the recommendations that have come from the panelists, and then end the session. So first I invite Alex, if you would wish to speak for a few minutes, maybe a couple of minutes, 2-3 minutes.
Thanks, Abra. I just wish to just respond to maybe 2 points that I'm seeing in the chat box. The first is maybe there's a certain misunderstanding. I was speaking about Singapore, and I think there may be a misunderstanding among those not familiar with Singapore who may imagine domestic work as work in the informal sector. Actually, domestic work among migrant workers in Singapore is very, very formal. They have proper documentation, they have proper work permits. If their salaries increase a bit more, they'll end up within the income tax payable bracket. So it's very formal. And in response to a particular comment, the salary problems right now that we as an organization are dealing with are all in the non-domestic sector. Now, that doesn't mean there are no women there. There are women, people working in the hospitality sectors and F&B. Restaurants are particularly affected by COVID-19, what with so many lockdowns. But the domestic sector right now is actually doing better because of COVID-19 in terms of these violations compared to the non-domestic sector. The second point I would like to make, I think somebody asked a question, I'm so sorry, there are quite a number of comments now, I don't know where it has gone to, is what can we do in the immediate term? And here I'm going to be contrarian again. The best thing that we can do in a destination country to protect the migrants there is actually already being done, which is to close the borders. Because once you close the borders, those migrants who are hid in your country suddenly have a whole lot more bargaining power. There are no more where they used to come from. And we've seen that already. They can get transfer jobs much easier now than they ever did before. They might not be able to get the salaries because the employer has gone bust, and that kind of thing, but they can get a new job. So, I mean, that may not be the answer that people want to hear, but empirically, that's what we're already seeing. Thanks.
Now I invite Ellen, if you could join us, Ellen.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Abrar. Maybe just to have some additional inputs. I saw in the chat box like the point of Debbie, where she's saying that, of course, countries of destination also are experiencing economic crisis. So but at the same time, households would want to keep the domestic workers, and then they become the domestic workers of the whole clan. And this is not something new, right? But of course, this COVID has exacerbated the situation. So the question is, so what protection protocol can we expect in this situation? So I think my thoughts is that we've been, and this has been also a recurring concern of the other participants, how can we extend social protection to domestic workers, for example? I think my first issue is, why has this become a big issue when this is supposed to be established issue? That if you are a worker, you are entitled not only to your wages, but some other issues of protection, unemployment, health access to health services, leaves, etc. But it becomes an issue because domestic workers for the longest time are not recognized as workers. And this is precisely the value of Convention 189. Of course, countries can argue that this is only applicable to countries that ratified. But the point is, this has been adopted with many countries and social partners of the ILO also subscribing to it. So I think you just have to start repeating that domestic workers are also workers very much like you and me. And if we feel that and we assert that we have rights and entitlement as workers, from wages to leave credits, to vacation, to social security, then we should not be questioning that for domestic workers. So I think we just have to get used to it, because also the other point is that employers of the domestic workers can be you and me as well, who are also low wage earners maybe. So we were confronted by one question of a trade unionist in the Philippines when we're discussing Convention on 89. So we were on the social protection, and he was saying, so you mean to say that whatever I earn, because he is also a minimum wage earner, I would just pass it on to my domestic worker? So I said, yes, if it need be, then that is the situation. So I think you just have to get used to it, that domestic workers are workers. So why would you question? Why would people question that they are entitled to all these other rights that other workers are entitled to? So that's the first point. And we're not even talking of COVID, but all the more that when you have COVID, they have proven time and again how important they are. And yet, when it comes to giving them their dues, we are so stingy. We are not so very generous in that regard. The other point is, yeah, everybody is undergoing a crisis. So just to go back to Debbie's point, so my take is, because of the domestic worker, all people of working age in that household can join the labor force. They can earn higher salaries, and again, this is the practical way that that households are looking at domestic workers. They take care of the house. Everybody who is able to work can work, and they get a lot more salary, and then they pay only very little to the domestic worker. So isn't that so it's very unfair? But then that is one way that our people should look at it, and so it's not, you cannot say that, oh, but if you go home to the Philippines, you're far worse off because you have nothing. No, that is not the way that we should be looking at it. And I think, again, that's the issue, that's the challenge here, changing the narrative of migration and emphasizing that without these essential workers, domestic workers included, we will really be for a collapse. So I think, yeah, and it's up to us to continue this advocacy, that it's not like they are just, that this is a humanitarian or charity case. They are workers. So I think, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Roula.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Abrar. No, maybe quickly 3 points. One of the questions in the chat box was regarding the economic crisis, and then the pressure on workers to accept kind of more difficult kind of working conditions, whether with wages and all of that. And I do share that concern. Actually, we see this happening, and we've seen this happen even kind of, a step further. For instance, the guidance here in Qatar is, workers and employers can agree, whatever that means, can agree to, changing work conditions, meaning lower salaries, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that brings into question the whole, the whole notion of the workers' consent to kind of lower standards and working conditions. That's one. And we've seen also kind of more concerning trends in the region. For instance, the drive to nationalize. So recently, in Qatar, there was a decision to either to reduce kind of the cost of foreign workers by 30%. Other countries, Saudis, also kind of going towards this nationalization. That I think in the long term will also we need to examine the whole question of what kind of opportunities will be available, and probably in this part of the world it will be less and less opportunity. COVID is one reason, the economic kind of crisis resulting from the the oil crisis as well is another, but that also may be an opportunity. This will not impact the domestic worker sector per se, but it will impact kind of women and other sectors as well in different occupations. But that may be an opportunity. I think there has been for a very long time kind of this trade-off between numbers and rights, and if the longer trend is going towards fewer migration, at least maybe that gives us an opportunity to rework that whole system so that it has rights in the center of it. The other just in response to Alex, it's really interesting to see the whole drive of no more workers available go into the trend of greater mobility. Unfortunately, in this region, it hasn't yet translated in that regards. Although I know, for instance, the ILO is really kind of advocating with Qatar, for instance, on the whole question of, job retention, but also job mobility and all of that. But so far, it hasn't really translated in policy. And it's interesting to contrast kind of the two models. The area of opportunity, I think, is really regarding to the whole issue of regularization. And I know Jean touched upon it. I mean, few months before COVID, this was not even a discussion in this part of the region, and now we find, more and more governments either doing amnesty programs or regularization programs. I think this is important. In terms of mobility, the only country which really had kind of a whatever scheme that was more flexible was actually Bahrain, who had the flexi visa, which also included domestic workers. But the kind of the backlash from COVID has actually kind of taken us away from that model. So we see now a lot of criticism touching on the flexi model and also on flexibility, and a lot of blame saying this happened because these are irregular workers, and that because the flexi visa has kind of allowed for models like this to exist. So I think also that the picture is mixed there.
Thank you. Dr. Dikuna, if you could.
Yes, so there are two questions that are specifically addressed to me, so I'll take those up. The first says, if, poor countries have no fiscal space, how are they to expand that and invest in, recovery packages to migrant workers? It is important to expand fiscal space and to spend in order to generate demand and to whip up the economy. Otherwise, you're just going to go down into a ground zero situation. So how can this fiscal space be expanded? G20 countries, the richer countries, have actually come up with large fiscal packages, at least for the immediate recovery of the economy. And G20 countries must play a leadership role and call for coordinated action, collaborative action to ensure or to push for debt relief, for debt cancellation, or for instance, expand global liquidity through special drawing rights. Now, there was an issue about that very recently. But the third thing is expansionary monetary policy, where you have credit expansion, increased credit for sectors in which women work or women's entrepreneurship, those particular sectors, through loan guarantees, other loan instruments, etc. Countries of origin can place, impose capital controls. There is space to tax wealth and to tax the most rich. I mean, there are some countries with small cohorts of billionaires who actually have, whose total income is more than the income of union budgets. So there's space to create those pockets of finance to invest in migrant workers if there is a will. The second question is, you mentioned legal and policy innovations or reforms in the Gulf countries. What are these? To what extent have they succeeded, or how effective are they? Well, yes, there have been policy reforms. A large number of reforms relate to domestic workers, but it's not labor law changes. It's special laws for domestic workers, or in a lesser scenario, decrease governing domestic workers' labor rights. So this is welcome and this is good, but they do fall short of ILO standards, for instance, in terms of minimum wages or in terms of collective bargaining, rights to associate, rest hours, and the like. The second important point I want to make is the variance between legislation and the contradictions between legislation. So while you might introduce a law regulating or providing labor protections for domestic workers, you do have the kafala system running side by side, and domestic workers are out of or excluded from whatever minimal reforms have been made to the kafala system. Thirdly, there have been reforms made to the kafala system. For instance, transfer from the ministries of interior to ministries of labor, and that has happened in Bahrain, but they've not yet taken it over, so to speak. And to some extent, in some countries, you can change your sponsor, you can contract other jobs. but domestic workers are not always included in this number one. And, sponsorship is transferred in some contexts to recruiting agents. And here we do have an issue about how forthright and how well these recruiting agents will be monitored. The third issue is the whole, when we talk about efficacy, is the whole question of accountabilities. You might slap bans, or you might make confiscation of travel documents illegal, but if you don't have adequate penalties and enforce that, then it is a question of accountability. And if you don't have adequate complaints, monitoring, grievance mechanism, then the whole question of accountability suffers. Also, design features of implementation. Many of these countries do have hotlines, which is very welcome, but the hotlines are not accessible. They're not in the languages of the domestic workers. Domestic workers or women migrant workers don't know how to use them, or they function and run at a time when they are not available or they are working. And the last question is the whole question of why it may not be so effective, is the whole question of social norms. If we, other domestic workers, women migrant workers, in terms of racism or nationality or sexism, xenophobia, or if we are constructing low-skilled workers as commodities, who are there to perform drudge labor and can be used and abused at will, then these violations will continue despite policies to protect workers, and therefore there is need for social norm change and awareness raising. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dikuna. We are nearing the end of the program, and we'll do so in next 4 to 5 minutes. For the journalist friends, we'll do a briefing soon after the formal program ends. Within 2 to 3 minutes after this program ends, we'll have a briefing for the journalists. Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui is going to brief the journalists on this. Now, we tried to capture some of the recommendations. And Zahid, if I may invite you to share it in the screen. Yes, these are some of the draft recommendations. Of course, there are quite a few others which had come. We will work on them and bring it for you. One of the first things that came across is there has to be both countries of origin and destination need to undertake a gender responsive assessment of the crisis, recovery packages and plans with particular focus on low-skilled women and men migrants. This has been one of the key sort of recommendations. Let's move on to the next one. And also the issue of call for investing on and preserving on women migrants' job, facilitate recovery of unpaid wages and assets left behind, allow women migrants the possibility of contracting other available jobs. That also came here. The issue of providing income support and ensure free testing and treatment for COVID-19 for all migrants in better equipped and infectious controlled environments in both countries of origin and destination have also been sort of proposed. It has also been argued that there has to be policies need to be framed in countries of origin so that women, that's the long term, are absorbed in employment in various sectors. The best option is to create employment at home, and that point has been made here. Move on. Ensure recognition of a number of women-dominated informal sectors, such as domestic work, as real work, guaranteeing decent working conditions and social protection. Another long-term is establish more diverse and safer pathways for women migration, including to sectors which are not traditionally considered as women sectors. Ensure labor law coverage in both countries of origin and destination, including for domestic workers, and their effective enforcement in line with ILO CEDAW standards. Ensure focus on combating the barriers that prevent migrant women from accessing justice and seeking remedies. And I think this is the final one, if I'm not mistaken. Bring about substantive reform of the kafala system and develop alternative to detention and deportation mechanisms through effectively leveraging on regional consultative processes on migration. Finally, ensure women have the right to mobility in labor market and ending status dependency on employers. Ensure non-discriminatory policy against women in both countries of origin and destination, and guarantee that migrant women can enjoy their family rights without discrimination. I think those were some of the recommendations that definitely were discussed here, and there are quite a few more. We'll try to sort of collect them together. And as I said, RMMRU sort of try to engage with policymakers, both nationally as well as regionally through our partners in Migrant Forum in Asia. We will circulate this widely so that, because these are not state specific, this is generic, and these problems need to be addressed collectively. It is in that spirit, we believe that this particular workshop, we consider it to be immensely successful, with the range of participation from about 17 countries, if not more. And many are still logged in, and quite a large number are viewing in our Facebook as it's been live. And I thank the panelists for the time that they have given and other forms of support they have extended. I thank all of you for putting your own time here and trying to listen to what we have to say in this regard. And we do believe with your participation in future, we continue with our important series that we are conducting on COVID-19 and migration called Build Back Better. There are quite a few ideas that have been floated here, recommendations have been made, and we very much wish all these are important bricks to build back better, most certainly. And thank you all very much. We bring a formal end to the session. Within 2 to 3 minutes, we will brief the journalists who would stay back for a Bangla briefing. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abrar.
Thank you, Tikwana. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. সাংবাদিক বন্ধুরা, আপনারা যারা থাকবেন, আপনারা একটু লগ ইন করে রাখেন। আমরা 2-3 মিনিটের মধ্যে আমরা চলে আসব। আর in the meantime, আপনারা যদি আপনাদের ইমেল অ্যাড্রেসটা চ্যাট বক্সে পাঠান, আমরা রেকমেন্ডেশনস গুলো আপনাদেরকে আমরা পাঠিয়ে দেব। ওগুলো ইংরেজিতে থাকবে, যেহেতু সময়ের অভাবে আমরা ওগুলো করতে পারিনি। আর যারা কাজে আমরা 2-3 মিনিটের মধ্যেই আমরা শুরু করব আমাদের এই ব্রিফিংটা। থ্যাংক ইউ। আমরা এখন শুরু করছি। We are starting our press briefing. We'll do it in Bangla. আমরা আমাদের আজকে যে আমরা আলোচনা সভা আয়োজন করলাম, সিম্পোজিয়াম, এটা আমরা পর্দা খুলে দাও, উইমেন মাইগ্রেন্টস, ড্রয়িং দ্য কার্টেন, উইমেন মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কার্স, তাদের এক্সপিরিয়েন্স নিয়ে আমরা আলোচনা করেছি। এবং সেখানে এটা আমাদের চতুর্থ আয়োজন, সিম্পোজিয়াম। এখানে লেবানন, তারপরে লেবানন, কায়রো, সিঙ্গাপুর এবং ম্যানিলা থেকে রিসোর্স পার্সনরা আমাদেরকে যোগ দিয়েছিলেন। এবং দুটো দেশে, বিশেষ করে সিঙ্গাপুর এবং ফিলিপিনের মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কারদের কি অবস্থা সেটা নিয়ে আলোচনা হয়েছে। এবং তারপর সাধারণভাবে আরব রিজনে, এখানে ইউএন উইমেনের রিপ্রেজেন্টেটিভ ছিলেন, যিনি আরব রিজনের তিনি এই ব্যাপারে দায়িত্বশীল ব্যক্তি, তিনি ছিলেন এবং প্রায় 20 বছরের তার অভিজ্ঞতা। এবং একই সাথে সাথে রুলা হামাতি, তিনি হচ্ছেন খুবই এই রিজনের অ্যাক্টিভিস্ট, যে সমস্ত নেটওয়ার্ক গুলো আছে তার সাথে সম্পৃক্ত। তারা সকলেই এটা 4 জন মিলে এই বিষয়গুলো নিয়ে আলোচনা করেছেন, যেটা আপনারা শুনেছেন। এটা একটা সংক্ষিপ্ত মানে উল্লেখযোগ্য দিকগুলো এখন তাসনিমকে বলার জন্য আমার সহকর্মী ডক্টর তাসনিম সিদ্দিকী, অধ্যাপক রাষ্ট্রবিজ্ঞান বিভাগ এবং প্রতিষ্ঠাতা চেয়ার রামরু, তাকে অনুরোধ করছি।
ওকে, আসলে এরকম একটা আলোচনা, এটাকে সার সংক্ষিপ্ত আকারে প্রকাশ করা, এটা আমার পক্ষে ধৃষ্টতা হবে। আর যদিও আমি শুরু থেকে সেভাবে চিন্তা করিনি, যেহেতু যে এটাকে ব্রিফ করতে হবে, তো আমি চেষ্টা করছি। আমি বলবো এত উচ্চ মার্গের আলোচনা হয়েছে যে এটা এই অল্প কথায় বলা যাবে না। তারপরেও আমি একটু করে চেষ্টা করি। সেটা হচ্ছে, প্রথম আমাদের যে আলোচক ছিলেন তিনি সিঙ্গাপুর বেসড এবং অভিবাসীদের নিয়ে কাজ করেন। বাংলাদেশি অভিবাসীদের বিভিন্ন রকমের সেবা কিন্তু তার প্রতিষ্ঠান দিয়ে থাকে, রাইটস এর পার্সপেক্টিভ থেকে তাদের সেবা দিয়ে থাকে। তিনি যখন কোভিড সিচুয়েশনে মহিলার অবস্থা এটার উপরে যখন কথা বলতে এলেন, তিনি বললেন যে সিঙ্গাপুরের সিচুয়েশনে মানে কোভিড আক্রান্ত যারা হয়েছে তাদের ভেতরে একেবারে 90, if I heard him right, 98% হচ্ছে অভিবাসী কর্মী। আর অভিবাসী কর্মীদের ভেতরে কারা এরা সবাই নন ডোমেস্টিক ওয়ার্কার, অর্থাৎ অন্যান্য সেক্টরে যারা কাজ করেন তারা, অর্থাৎ কনস্ট্রাকশন বা সার্ভিস বা এইসব সেক্টরে যারা করেন তারা। যারা ডোমেস্টিক ওয়ার্কে কাজ করেন তাদের হয়তো অন্য অনেক রকম অসুবিধা আছে, অনেক রকমের আছে, ভায়োলেশন অফ রাইট আছে, কিন্তু তারা কোভিডে আক্রান্ত হননি বা কোভিডের কারণে খারাপ সিচুয়েশনে পড়েছেন, এটা তিনি মনে করছেন না। এখন এটা আমি বলবো না যে উনি জাত্যাভিমান থেকে বলেছেন এই কারণে, কারণ উনি কিন্তু একদম রাইট নিয়েই কাজ করেন। উনি যেই কথাটা বলেছেন উনি চিন্তা ভাবনা করেই বলেছেন যে ওখানে বাড়ির ভিতরে যে মহিলারা কাজে রয়েছেন তারা বেটার আছেন এই কারণে। আর দুটো কারণ তিনি বলেছেন, একটা হচ্ছে অন্যান্য দেশে ডোমেস্টিক ওয়ার্ক যেরকম লেবার ল এর অধীনে নয়, তার দেশে বিষয়টা সেরকম নয়। তার দেশে ডোমেস্টিক ওয়ার্ক ও লেবার ল এর অধীনে, যার ফলে সেইখানটায় মানে এই কোভিড সিচুয়েশনের যে অসুবিধাগুলো সেগুলো মহিলারা তুলনামূলকভাবে পুরুষের তুলনায়, পুরুষ কর্মীর তুলনায়, মাইগ্রেন্টের তুলনায় কম ফেস করেছেন। এই জায়গাটাই তিনি হাইলাইট করেছেন। দ্বিতীয় বক্তা ছিলেন এলেন সানা, উনিও একজন অ্যাক্টিভিস্ট, উন্নয়ন মাইগ্রেশন অ্যাক্টিভিস্ট, এবং তার কথা থেকেই আমরা দেখেছি যে তিনি প্রথমে পুরো ফিলিপাইন এর কনটেক্সটে নারী অভিবাসনটাকে তুলে ধরতে চেষ্টা করেছেন। এবং আমরা জানি একদম শুরুর দিকে কিন্তু ফিলিপিন্স থেকে অভিবাসনটা শুরুই হয়েছিল নারী অভিবাসন দিয়ে। সুতরাং সেখানে প্রায় এটা 60, 70, 80 ভাগও ছিল নারী অভিবাসী, পুরুষ অভিবাসী ছিল কম, মহিলারাই বেরিয়েছিল প্রথম কাজের জন্য। এখন মাঝে ফিলিপিন্স চেষ্টা করেছিল নারী অভিবাসন কমিয়ে ফেলতে, কারণ হচ্ছে বিভিন্ন রকমের এক্সপ্লয়টেশন এবং বিভিন্ন রকমের সেক্সুয়াল হ্যারাসমেন্ট ইত্যাদির কারণে মধ্যপ্রাচ্য থেকে নারী অভিবাসন তারা কমিয়ে ফেলতে চেষ্টা করেছে এবং একটা পর্যায়ে 40% নামিয়েও এনেছিল। কিন্তু এখন আবার ইদানিং আবার দেখা গেল এটা 60% মতন, আবার টোটাল অভিবাসী ওই দেশের যা আছে তার ভিতরে 60%-এরই মতন হচ্ছেন নারী অভিবাসী। এখন এই জায়গাটায় যে পরিবর্তনটা যেটা হয়েছে সেটা হচ্ছে নারী অভিবাসীর আগে মধ্যপ্রাচ্যের দেশে যেতেন, এখন তারা ইউরোপ আমেরিকার উন্নত দেশগুলোতেও যাচ্ছেন। তো যার ফলে হয়তো তাদের এক্সপ্লয়টেশনের মাত্রাটা কম, অন্যরকম এটা, কিন্তু মাত্রাটা হয়তো কম। এখন এই জায়গা থেকে উনি যে জায়গায় আসছেন সেটা হচ্ছে যে কোভিড সিচুয়েশন ডেফিনেটলি অনেককেই ফিরিয়ে এনেছে। প্রায় 8000 কর্মী তার দেশে ফিরে এসেছেন, এবং আমি যদি ওনাকে ঠিক শুনে থাকি, উনি পুরুষ না মহিলা কতটা উনি জানেন না, তবে ধরে নেওয়া যায় অর্ধেকের বেশি মহিলা হতে পারেন, কারণ ওনাদের মহিলা অভিবাসী বেশি। তো তিনি বলছেন যে এরা যারা ফিরে এসছেন, ফিরে এসে তার দেশে এই যে মানে তাদের বিরুদ্ধে যে তাদেরকে সবসময় দেশের হিরো হিসেবে চিন্তা করা হয়েছে, তাদেরকে প্রধানমন্ত্রী গিয়ে বছরে একদিন হ্যান্ডশেক করে তাদের এয়ারপোর্ট থেকে নিয়ে আসেন যে তোমরাই দেশের হিরো, আমাদের হিরো তোমরা। কিন্তু সেই মানুষগুলো এই কোভিড পরিবেশে কিন্তু যখন দেশে ফিরেছেন তারা কিন্তু মানে চিহ্নিত হয়েছেন যে কোভিড ছড়াতে পারেন বলে তাদের উপরে বিভিন্ন রকমের যে সিকিউরিটাইজেশন যেটা হয়েছে, যেটা দুঃখজনক বলে তিনি মনে করছেন। আর তিনি অ্যালেক্সের সাথে একমত নন যে মহিলারা কম এফেক্টেড বা কম কষ্ট পাচ্ছে। উনি যেটা বলতে চান যে আমরা জানি না, আমাদের কাছে তথ্য নেই, ইনফরমেশন নেই, মহিলারা ঘরের ভেতরে কি ধরনের অবস্থানে আছেন সেটার আমাদের তথ্য নেই। কিন্তু এর মানে এই নয় যে মহিলারা কোভিডের কারণে বিভিন্ন রকমের স্ট্রাগলের মুখে পড়ছেন না, নতুন রকম চ্যালেঞ্জের মুখে পড়ছেন না। তিনি সেই জায়গা থেকে আমরা যদি চলে আসি, তারপরে আমাদের যে বক্তা বললেন রোলা, আই থিঙ্ক তিনি আমাদের জন্য খুবই একটা কি বলবো, খুবই একটা ইয়ের জায়গা যে আগে আমরা সাধারণত মধ্যপ্রাচ্যের কোনো দেশে কোনো রাইট অ্যাক্টিভিস্টকে সাথে অত বেশি পেতাম না, কিন্তু আপনারা দেখলেন যে কতটা অধিকার সচেতন, নারী অধিকারের প্রসঙ্গে যখন উনি আজকে কথা বলছিলেন, তিনি ঘরের ভেতরে যে তিনি বলছেন যে কোভিডের কারণে যেই অসুবিধাগুলো লেবানন বিশেষ করে মহিলারা ফেস করেছে ওগুলো উনি তুলে ধরলেন। উনি বললেন দুই রকম কর্মী আছে, একটা হচ্ছে যে পরিবারে থাকে, ঘরের ভিতরে থেকে গৃহকর্ম করে, বাংলাদেশের কর্মীরা মূলত কিন্তু সেরকম। কিন্তু শ্রীলঙ্কা এবং অন্যান্য দেশে ফিলিপিন্সের কর্মী আছেন যারা বাড়িতে থাকেন না, তারা নিজেরা বাড়ি ভাড়া করে থাকেন এবং সেখান থেকে কাজে যান, কাজে আসেন, কাজ করে ফেরত আসেন। এমনিতে তাদের সিচুয়েশন হোম বাউন্ড ওয়ার্কারের চেয়ে ভালো, কিন্তু এই পরিস্থিতিতে, কোভিড পরিস্থিতিতে এই মানুষগুলো যারা কাজ থেকে ফিরে আসতেন তারা এখন দেখা গেল ঝট করে এদের সবার চাকরি ছাড়িয়ে দিয়েছে, মানে যারা এমপ্লয় করে রেখেছিলেন তারা তাদের চাকরিটা ছাড়িয়ে দিয়েছেন। এবং চাকরি ছাড়িয়ে দেওয়ার ফলে তারা যে শুধু খাওয়া পড়ার অসুবিধায় থেকেছেন তাই নয়, তাদের থাকার জায়গার বাড়ি ভাড়াটা পর্যন্ত তারা দিতে পারছেন না, এবং তাদের অনেককেই কিন্তু ডিটেনশনে নিয়ে চলে যাওয়া হয়েছে, যে কারণ সে ইলিগাল হয়ে গেছে। এদের অনেকে এদের অনেককে তারপরে ফোর্সফুলি রিপ্যাট্রিয়েট করিয়ে দেওয়া হয়েছে মহিলাদেরকে, অথচ তাদের কর্ম ভিসা কিন্তু তাদের ছিল। এবং তিনি শুধু এই কোভিড সিচুয়েশনের দিকে তাকিয়ে বলছেন যে এই যে অবস্থাটা যে অভিবাসীদের, যে নারী অভিবাসীদের অবস্থাটা যে কোভিড সিচুয়েশন স্পেসিফিক তা নয়, এটা এমনি সময়ও খারাপ, কিন্তু কোভিড সিচুয়েশনটা এটা আমাদের চোখে আঙ্গুল দিয়ে দেখিয়ে দিল যে অবস্থাটা কত খারাপ। এবং সেখানটায় তিনি যখন রেকমেন্ডেশনের জায়গায় আসছেন, তিনি মূল জায়গায় যাচ্ছেন হচ্ছে যে কাফালা সিস্টেম যেটা রয়েছে এখনো পর্যন্ত, সেই কাফালা সিস্টেমের পরিবর্তন না আসলে হবে না। আর যুগ যুগ ধরে সবাই যেহেতু কাফালা সিস্টেমের বিরুদ্ধে বলছে, ওইসব দেশের সরকার এটা আর শুনতে চান না, বলেন অন্য কোনো কথা বলো। কিন্তু তিনি বলছেন যে এটা এমন একটা স্ট্রাকচারাল সমস্যা, এই সমস্যার সমাধান না করে অন্য কোনো সমস্যার দিকে যাওয়া, অন্য কোনো সমস্যার উত্তরণের কথা আমরা চিন্তা করতে পারি না। তো মানে তার দিক থেকে হলো নারীর অধিকার বা গৃহকর্মীর অধিকার এবং গৃহকর্মীর বাইরে যারা আছেন তাদেরও অধিকার মানে খুবই ভায়োলেটেড হয় বিভিন্ন সময়ে বিভিন্ন ভাবে। এবং এখন এই সিচুয়েশনে যারা বাড়ির ভিতরে কাজ করছেন তাদের এক্সট্রিম স্ক্রুটিনি, এক্সট্রিম সিচুয়েশনগুলি ফেস করতে হয়েছে এবং হচ্ছে। এবং এর পরে যদি আমরা আসি, কে ছিলেন এরপরে, জিন ডিকুনা বোধহয়, জিন ডিকুনার বক্তব্য সামারাইজ করা উইল বি ভেরি ডিফিকাল্ট, তবে এইটুকুই বলবো উনি প্রথম হার্ট করেছেন যে বাড়ির ভিতরে যে কাজের অবস্থানগুলো মহিলার কি হচ্ছে, মহিলা এখন কিন্তু বাচ্চা বাসায়, মহিলারা বাসায় এবং পুরুষরা বাসায়, এটার ফলাফল কি কাজের চাপ দ্বিগুণ তিনগুণ। এবং আরেকটা বিষয় কি, এগুলো থাকার কারণে যে ক্লোজ স্ক্রুটিনি, প্রতিটা কাজে সবাই স্ট্রেস যে আমি মারা যেতে পারি, আমার এটা হতে পারে, এই স্ট্রেসগুলি কার উপরে নেবেন? আমরা জানি যে ডোমেস্টিক ভায়োলেন্সের যে গল্প, সেটা হচ্ছে পুরুষ এটা বাড়ির ভেতরে নারীর উপরে নেয়, এবং এটা হচ্ছে যে এখন এই জিনিসটা আবার যাচ্ছে ডোমেস্টিক ওয়ার্কারের উপরে। সো তাহলে মানে এই যে ট্রান্সফার্ড অ্যাগ্রেশন যেটা সিচুয়েশনের, যেহেতু এখন ক্লোজ স্ক্রুটিনি, একটা কাজ ভুল হলে এসে ধরছেন, কারণ সবার মাথার ভেতরে আছে যে আমরা একটু যদি তরকারিটা তো নয়, সবজি ভালো করে না ধুই, যদি ঘরের ওই কোণা না পরিষ্কার করি, তাহলে মারা যেতে পারি। তাহলে কি হচ্ছে যে অসম্ভব কাজের চাপ এবং অসম্ভব তাদের উপরে মেজাজ রাগ। তো এই জায়গাটা আমি একটু হয়তো ডিফার করব, যে কারণ এমন কেসও আমরা পেয়েছি যেখানে নারী শ্রমিকরা বলছেন যে আগে যতটা আমাদের অবজ্ঞা করা হতো, এখন কিন্তু আমাদের আরেকটু ভালো মতো ট্রিট করা হচ্ছে, কারণ আমার যদি অসুখ হয় তাদেরও অসুখ হবে, সুতরাং আমি খেলাম কিনা, আমি ভালো জিনিসটা করলাম কিনা, এইগুলো দিকে মালিকরা কিন্তু এমপ্লয়াররা লক্ষ্য রাখছেন। এটা আমরা পেয়েছি বাংলাদেশি মহিলাদের কাছে। কিন্তু ওনার দিক থেকে উনি যেগুলো দেখেছেন জেনারেলাইজ করেছেন, বেশিরভাগ ক্ষেত্রেই হয়তো অভিজ্ঞতাটা হচ্ছে তাদের উপরে বেশি চাপের। এবং সেই আমার মনে হয় উনি এত গুরুত্বপূর্ণ কথাগুলো বলেছেন যে জেন্ডার রেসপন্সিভ একটা রিসার্চ প্রয়োজন, যে কি হচ্ছে এবং কি করা যায়। এবং তিনি বলছেন যে আমরা যদি এই কোভিড সিচুয়েশনটাকে, এই চ্যালেঞ্জটাকে একটা অপরচুনিটিতে রূপান্তরিত করতে চাই, তাহলে এটাই সুযোগ এখন জোরের সাথে ধরা এবং একটা পুরো রিসার্চ করা কোভিডে কি হলো, এবং সেই রিসার্চটা হবে জেন্ডার রেসপন্সিভ, অর্থাৎ মানে প্রত্যেকটা জায়গায় নারীর কি হচ্ছে, পুরুষের পাশাপাশি নারী কোনভাবে এফেক্টেড, কোথায় বেটার, এই জিনিসটা প্রত্যেকটা কন্টিনিউয়াসলি প্রত্যেকটা স্তরে স্তরে করে এগিয়ে যাবার জন্য বলছেন। আর আরেকটা হচ্ছে যে এই যে ওয়েজ থেফট বলছি, জব বলছি, যেগুলো হারাচ্ছে, সেই রিকভারির জন্য, সেইগুলোর জন্য কিন্তু পলিসি এবং কাজ, সেই জিনিসগুলো দরকার। আর এই যে কোভিড সিচুয়েশনে ফ্রি টেস্টিং, ফ্রি যেসব ইয়েগুলো দেয়া দরকার, এইগুলো দেয়া হচ্ছে কিনা, এগুলোর ব্যাপারেও জোর আমাদের বক্তব্য তুলে ধরা দরকার। আর ডোমেস্টিক সেক্টর শুধু নারীর অভিবাসনের ক্ষেত্র নয়, অনেক জায়গায় অন্য ক্ষেত্রেও মহিলারা কাজ করছেন। আর যদি যে ফিগারটা আমরা দেখলাম, খুব সময় লড়া দিয়েছিল এবং জিন্ডিকুনাও দিয়েছেন, যে প্রায় মধ্যপ্রাচ্যের গালফ স্টেটে প্রায় 39% হচ্ছে নারী শ্রমিক। এবং যেটা আমাদের এখানটায় অ্যাড করেছেন কুয়েতের প্রসঙ্গে, আমাদের নাসরা শাহ, প্রফেসর নাসরা শাহ অ্যাড করলেন, কুয়েতের দিকে প্রতিটা বাড়িতে মানে 87% বাড়িতে একজন অন্তত গৃহকর্মী রয়েছেন, কোন বাড়িতে 3 থেকে 4 জন গৃহকর্মীও রয়েছেন। সো তাহলে এই যে গৃহকর্মীদের অবস্থা, সেই জিনিসটার ওই ধরনের অ্যানালিসিস প্রয়োজন, যেটা মানে কোভিড সিচুয়েশনে জেন্ডারকে মাথায় নিয়ে এটা অ্যানালিসিস করবে। আর ইনফর্মাল সেক্টরে অন্য যে মহিলা রয়েছেন কাজ করছেন, ইভেন ক্লিনিং সেক্টরেও যে মহিলা কাজ করছেন, তার হয়তো বা ডোমেস্টিক ওয়ার্কারের ভালনারেবিলিটি একরকম, ক্লিনিং সেক্টরে যারা কাজ করছেন, ফিলিপিন্সের কনটেক্সটে মারলা আসিস উপস্থাপন করলেন যে ওই ক্লিনিং সেক্টরের মহিলারা কিন্তু অনেক বেশি ভালনারেবল, কারণ তারা তো এইসব পরিষ্কার করছেন, তারা হসপিটালে আছেন, তারা তাদের বিষয়গুলো কিন্তু আমাদের খুব একটা তথ্য নাই, জানা নাই। তাহলে জেন্ডারের জায়গায় আসতে হলে আমাদের কিন্তু প্রত্যেকটা জায়গা ভেঙে ভেঙে জানতে হবে, এবং জানার জন্য প্রয়োজন কি স্টাডি, জানার জন্য প্রয়োজন গবেষণা। এই তো, আর পুরোটা জায়গায় রাইট টু মোবিলিটি, হ্যাঁ, এই জিনিসটার উপরেই জোর দিয়েছেন, যে নারীকে যেভাবে আমরা সবসময় চিন্তা করি যে নারীকে প্রোটেক্ট করতে হলে তার উপরে ব্যান দিয়ে দেওয়া বা তাকে বাইরে যেতে না দেওয়া, এরকম ভাবে চিন্তা করি, এইটা চিন্তা না করে নারীর মোবিলিটি থাকবে, তার রাইট টু ওয়ার্ক থাকবে, এবং সেই কাজটা সে করার জন্য সেই কাজটা করার জন্য তার অধিকার আছে এবং প্রোটেকশন নিয়ে সে সেই কাজটা করবে। এইরকম পরিস্থিতিতে যাওয়ার জন্য ইউএন উইমেন কাজ করে, এবং ইউএন উইমেনের দিক থেকে আরো যত বিভিন্ন সিডো, আইএলও, সমস্ত যত কনভেনশন রয়েছে সমস্ত কিছুকে মিলিয়ে তিনি বলছেন যে নারীর প্রোটেকশনের জায়গাটা এনশিওর করতে হবে, ইন জেনারেল সকলের প্রোটেকশনের জায়গা এনশিওর করতে হবে। আমার মনে হয় আমি এইটুকু গেস মানে তুলতে পেরেছি, আরো অনেক সুন্দর সুন্দর কথা ছিল, আমি সরি যে আমি সবটুকু ক্যাপচার করতে পারিনি। ধন্যবাদ। আপনার কি এখানটায়?
ম্যাডাম আমরা কি দু একটা প্রশ্ন করতে পারি?
হ্যাঁ করতে পারেন, কিন্তু আমি তো হ্যাঁ করেন, আমি উত্তর দিয়ে দেবো থেকে যতটুকু বুঝেছি।
হ্যাঁ, আমি মেহেদি আলামিন, ঢাকা ট্রিবিউনে কাজ করছি। আপনাদের সিম্পোজিয়ামটা খুবই ইন্টারন্যাশনাল মানের, কারণ অনেকগুলো দেশ থেকে পার্টিসিপেট করেছে পার্টিসিপেন্টরা এবং তারা কথা বলেছে। তো সেখানে আমরা বিভিন্ন সময় আপনার সাথে কথা বলি, কমেন্টস নেই, বিপদে বলে আপনার কাছে যাই, বিভিন্ন বিষয়ে জানতে চাই। তো এখন যেটা জানতে চাচ্ছি যে এখন একটা এত বড় একটা ফোরামে প্রাইভেট লেভেল, তারপর আপনার সিভিল সোসাইটি বা গভর্নমেন্ট লেভেল, ডিপ্লোম্যাটিক লেভেলটা গুরুত্বপূর্ণ। তো এই দেশগুলো সবাই সেন্ডিং কান্ট্রি, যেটা আমি কোশ্চেন করেছিলাম যে এই প্ল্যাটফর্মটাকে আপনারা গভর্নমেন্ট গুলাকে যুক্ত করতে সামনে কোনো পদক্ষেপ নেবেন কিনা এখান থেকে, যাতে বিভিন্ন সেন্ডিং কান্ট্রির গভর্নমেন্ট গুলো একত্রিত হয়ে অ্যাডভোকেসিতে যায়, কারণ প্রত্যেকেই কম্পিটিটর, প্রত্যেকে, কিন্তু আবার আপনার গোলটা কমন, যে রাইটস থাকতে হবে, ঠিক থাকতে হবে। তো সেক্ষেত্রে একটা প্ল্যাটফর্ম হতে পারে কিনা, আপনাদের আলোচনাতে এসেছিল কিনা বা সামনের সিম্পোজিয়াম গুলোতে আসবে কিনা, রিসিভিং কান্ট্রি গুলোর গভর্নমেন্ট গুলোর সাথে সেন্ডিং কান্ট্রি গভর্নমেন্ট গুলো মিলিতভাবে নেগোসিয়েশন।
আচ্ছা, আমার মনে হচ্ছে এখানে দুটো জিনিস আপনার, একটা হচ্ছে যে আমরা যে এই প্ল্যাটফর্ম থেকে যে আলোচনা, এখান থেকে যে আলোচনাটা, রামরুত থেকে যে আলোচনাগুলো হয়েছে, এইগুলোতে আমরা মূলত এক্সপার্টদের মতামতগুলো শুনছি, এবং এই এক্সপার্টদের মতামতের পাশাপাশি আমাদের প্রাইভেট সেক্টর এবং আমাদের যে গভর্নমেন্ট, তাদেরকেও যুক্ত করা দরকার। এটা একটা জিনিস আমি আপনার কাছ থেকে পেলাম। আরেকটা জিনিস হচ্ছে যে এইসব ফোরামে আমরা ভবিষ্যতে মানে বোথ সেন্ডিং কান্ট্রির এবং রিসিভিং কান্ট্রির সরকারের রিপ্রেজেন্টেটিভকেও আনতে পারি কিনা এই কথাগুলোতে, তাহলে হবে কি ইনফর্মাল সিভিল সোসাইটি প্ল্যাটফর্মের ভেতরে এসে আলোচনাগুলি উঠে আসলে সেটা আরো ভালো মতো অধিকার রক্ষার দিকে যাবে। আমার মনে হয় এটা আপনার এটা খুব ভালো প্রস্তাব, ভবিষ্যতে ওভাবে এগুলো যেতে পারে। আমরা দুটো, একটা মানে আলোচনা যেটা বাংলাদেশে ওয়েজ থেফটের উপরে করেছি, অর্থাৎ বাংলাদেশে আরবিট্রারি রিটার্ন এবং তাদের যে ওয়েজ থেফট, সেখানে কিন্তু আমরা সরকারকে খুব ভালো মতো রেখেছি, কারণ এটা বাংলাদেশের পলিসির দিকে তাকানো। আর আমরা সামনে যেটা করতে যাচ্ছি 27 তারিখে কিন্তু আমরা আরেকটা করতে যাচ্ছি, এই বিল্ড ব্যাক বেটার, এটার অধীনেই আপনার হয়তো একটু বলে দিলে ভালো হতো, খেয়াল করেনি। এইটাতে কিন্তু আমাদের আবার যেহেতু এটা সরকার মানে বাংলাদেশে অভিবাসীরা কেমন আছেন, সেখানে কিন্তু আমাদের মিনিস্টার, ইনফ্যাক্ট আমাদের এক্সপ্যাট্রিয়েট ওয়েলফেয়ার এন্ড ওভারসিজ এমপ্লয়মেন্ট মন্ত্রণালয়ের মিনিস্টার ইমরান, মাননীয় মন্ত্রী ইমরান রহমানই তো নাম ওনার, উনি থাকবেন। এবং আমাদের যেহেতু এখানটায় পরিবার কেমন আছে রিলিফে যুক্ত করার ব্যাপারটা আসবে, সেখানে আমরা চেষ্টা করছি আনতে চেষ্টা করছি ডক্টর এনামুর রহমান, উনি রিলিফ কাজটা পরিচালনা করছেন। তো এমনিতে আমার মনে হয় এটা প্রস্তাব আকারে থাকুক, আমরা চিন্তা করব যে আমরা এখানে তাহলে বিভিন্ন দেশের সরকার এদেরকেও আনতে পারি কিনা, তাদের রিপ্রেজেন্টেটিভ আনতে পারি কিনা। এবং এই যে আপনার কথাটা যেটা ছিল, এটা খুব ভালো কথা ছিল, যে ইয়েটা যে আমরা দেখো দুঃখটা কোথায়, দুঃখটা হচ্ছে আমরা একজন আরেকজনের সাথে কম্পিট করে আমরা কিন্তু আমাদের ওয়েজ, আমাদের সমস্ত কিছু নিচু করে দিচ্ছি। সেখানে আমরা ওপেকের মতন আমরা কেন এক হতে পারছি না, যেখানে আমরা এর কম বেতনে কাজ করব না, এর কম সোশ্যাল প্রোটেকশনে কাজ করব না, এগুলো চিন্তা করতে পারি। সরকার টু সরকার তো অনেক হয়েছে, কলম্বো প্রসেস, এটা সেটা, আমরা সিভিল সোসাইটি লেভেল থেকে শুরু করতে পারি কিনা, এইটা একটা ব্যাপার আমরা হতে পারে চিন্তাটায় আসতে পারে।
মন্ত্রীর নাম ডক্টর মিস্টার ইমরান আহমেদ।
ওকে, উনি আসবেন, আমরা খুব খুশি। সিভিল সোসাইটির কোনো প্রোগ্রামে কিন্তু এর আগে উনি সেভাবে আসেননি, উনি যে রাজি হয়েছেন, আমরা খুশি যে আমরা আমাদের দিক থেকে যে আলোচনাগুলো তাকে শোনাতে পারবো। আর কারো প্রশ্ন আছে?
থ্যাংক ইউ
আমরা রেকমেন্ডেশনস গুলো আমরা আপনারা যারা ইমেল অ্যাড্রেস গুলো এখানে দিয়েছেন আমার কলিগ মিনিট 10 মধ্যে আপনাদেরকে রেকমেন্ডেশনস গুলো পাঠিয়ে দেবে। আমরা আগের থেকেই পার্টিসিপেন্টের কাছ থেকে নিয়ে রেখেছিলাম যাতে আপনাদের সুবিধার্থে, আমরা অতীতেও করেছি যে রেকমেন্ডেশনস গুলো পেলে আপনাদেরও একটু সুবিধা হয়, সেটা আমরা করেছি। থ্যাংক ইউ। হ্যাঁ, তাহলে আমার মনে হয় শেষ করো। অশেষ ধন্যবাদ আপনারা ছিলেন এবং আমাদের ডাইভার্স যেটা বলেছিলাম পার্টিসিপেশন ছিল বিভিন্ন হিউম্যান রাইটস কমিশন থেকে শুরু করে অন্যান্য আরো জিনিভা থেকে যোগ দিয়েছিলেন। সো উই আর ডিলাইটেড।
17টা দেশ থেকে নাকি?
17টা দেশ থেকে, ইয়েমেন, সেনেগাল এ সমস্ত থেকেও ছিল, অস্ট্রেলিয়া, ইউকে, কানাডা, এগুলো
একটু বলে দিলে ভালো হয় সাংবাদিকদের।
কোনটা?
এই যে কত দেশ থেকে এখানে পার্টিসিপেট
আমরা জাহেদ প্রেস লিস্টের মধ্যে তাহলে ইসের মধ্যে দিয়ে দেবেন, ওই লিস্টের সাথে দিয়ে দেবেন। কারণ